And with that, we have come to the part of the demo. Before switching screens, we're looking at a simple infection here. And in reality, things might not always be this straightforward, but the same principles still apply even if you are dealing with more complex malware. I'm now going to bring up the virtual machine. If at this point you haven't enabled full screen mode, it would probably be a good idea to do so, because otherwise it might be hard to follow along what you see on the screen. This is a simple Windows 10 virtual machine using VMware. It's up to date and it has a simple infection running, which we will check out with autoruns. I'm going to launch autoruns as an administrator to make sure I have all appropriate permissions. I have adjusted the font size a bit. I hope you all can follow along. I will maximize it. Okay, so as I already told you, autorun shows you a whole lot of load points. And that's all very nice to know, but if you see this list, it might look as a lot of gibberish and really confusing information. Because in order to know what's bad here, you also need to know what's good. I already gave one example, this first line, in the article. If you haven't read that, you can maybe look it up later if you're interested. So we will just continue. Let's just start at the top. The alternate shell value we have checked out in the article. Then the next items are some run key values. You can see these are located in the local machine branch of the registry. That means such run values will be loaded anytime Windows is started, no matter which user is logged on. And we have 4 objects here. They all look pretty good. The first one is MTSoft Anti-Malware. I have that installed on the virtual machine. It's disabled, so it won't interfere with malware. You can check quickly the file path here. I'm not currently not checking any comments submitted, so if you have questions, I will address them later, because that will require me to switch a few times view. Okay, as you can see, this is a legitimate path for MTSoft's startup entry. You could check the file on VirusTotal if you wanted, but it's really not necessary in this case. The second one is from Windows Defender. It also looks legitimate. The third one is from VMware User Process. It's part of the VMware tools, which has been installed on this virtual machine. Also a pretty normal path. Then we have another Windows Defender item, also legitimate. And we end up at the 32-bit run values. There's only one of these. This just means there is a 32-bit version of Java running. Its update was running. The program is installed. You could check that by opening the programs and features list and check if it's really installed. But this is legitimate. The path is also legitimate. Then next, we end up at the current user run key. The current user run key is a run key which entries will only be loaded if this particular user is logged in. So if I would create another user profile, this entry would not be there unless I would put it there. And this entry is a bit different than before. As you can see, the run value name here is a string of random letters and numbers. That already makes it a bit suspicious, because you would expect something that's somehow humanly readable in run values. It could be a bit more obscure, but not this obscure. This is just, well, random. And then what you see here in these columns, the description, the publisher, and the image path, the description and publisher are taken from the file metadata. The data can be completed by the developer of the file. And here we see another problem. It says, well, I suspect it's supposed to say Windows Service, except it doesn't say Windows Service. It says Windows Service. That's a typo. Microsoft usually doesn't make that sort of typos in its Windows Service files. And the publisher would never be Windows Service. It would be Microsoft Corporation or something similar. Then let's look at the image path. So the file that's been loaded by this entry. It's located in the temp folder, and it's a file named svhost.exe. If you're familiar with Windows, you will know Windows has a legitimate file named svchost.exe. So I suspect someone wanted to make it look like we're dealing with a legitimate file here, but they failed. We will check this file more in detail a bit later. Let's move on, because we've ended up at the startup folder now. You can see the path here. The startup folder is a folder that may contain files that are launched once Windows is finished starting. And look at that, we see a file that has an identical name to the value we already found before. This file is an executable, a .exe file, which is already very suspicious, because in the startup folder you usually put shortcuts to programs you want to open when Windows starts. For example, you can put a shortcut to your browser there, or a shortcut to your favorite email program, but not an executable, usually something that would belong to a folder. This file has no really interesting metadata listed here, but these two entries are pretty suspicious, so let's look in detail at them. And we will start with this one because it's the simplest one. It doesn't have registry references, it's just one file in one startup folder. To get a bit more information about the file, we could look at its properties, but let's first submit it to VirusTotal, because we might get an idea of how malicious it is if it's known. I submitted a hash, and look at that, the detection rate is 47 out of 66. That's not really good for this file. Let's see what we got. As you can see, there's a pretty good detection rate. Also, the file name all of a sudden is game.exe, which also, yeah, that's not legitimate. And there's a big list of infection names here. The names doesn't tell us that much here. Well, they do, but not so much that we can Google the infection name and find information on this particular infection. It will be more generic. So for now, we won't do that because we don't need it. VirusTotal kind of confirms this is malicious, as does the file name and the file extension. We wouldn't expect a random .exe file in the startup folder. So we can safely say this file is malicious. But we're not going to delete it yet. We're going to copy it and save it in a Notepad file. I'm using Notepad because that's what's available on Windows. I would strongly suggest to use another text editor, whatever you prefer, because there are much better text editors than Notepad. Okay, I have saved this file. I can make some notes here. Many hits on VirusTotal. Exit file with random name. Just those notes are for yourself. You don't have to make them. You can make them if you want to check them later to get an idea of what you're dealing with. You could also put in a link to the VirusTotal results or whatever information you find. Okay, let's minimize this and let's move on to the next one. Here we have two components to check. There's the registry reference and the file itself. So let's start at the registry. I can jump to the entry by clicking Jump to Entry. That opens the key. You can see it here. The current user branch, software, Microsoft Windows, current version, run key. And this is the value. You can see the whole name like this. And here is the path, and that is similar to the one listed here. I will make the column a bit larger to make it visible. You can see both are the same. So this is where Autoruns gets the information. It displays in this line, this part of the line. This is the image path, this one. And the information here, it extracts from the file it reads in the image path. So as we said, this does not look good. We would expect some humanly readable string here, not just some numbers and letters. And as said, the file path, well, you usually don't have run entries in the temp folder, run from the temp folder, because, well, the temp folder can get cleaned out, and you would expect a normal program file, program path to see here. It's still only the fact that the file is run from the temp folder alone doesn't make it malicious, but the fact that this file tries to impersonate a legitimate Windows file with legitimate Windows metadata and has a totally random value name, that altogether makes it pretty suspicious. So next, let's look at the file itself. We can do that, but jump to image. And there is our sv host.exe file in the temp folder. We can check its properties. Right-clicking on properties. And just to compare, because this is impersonating svc host.exe, let's also call up the legitimate svc host.exe properties. That file is located in the system32 folder. And there we have it, as well as its properties. I hope these are visible for everyone. The first big difference here is that the legitimate file has a digital signature, and I think it's valid, while the suspicious file has not. Let's also compare the details. Details here and details here. As you can see, the file description for the suspicious file is Windows Service with the typo. The legitimate file would be host process for Windows Service without a typo. The type application, the file version, that's not that interesting because you will see most exe files are applications, so that's pretty normal. The product name, again, Windows Service. Well, the product name wouldn't be Windows Service. As we can see here, it's Microsoft Windows Operating System, which is to be expected for a legitimate Windows file. The product version is also not really important, although you can clearly see it's not the same. Then the copyright 2017 doesn't look that suspicious, but if you compare it with the actual copyright line from Microsoft, which says Microsoft Corporation, all rights reserved, it doesn't look very similar. Sizes aren't that important here. They have different sizes because there are different files. Then legal trademarks. This file doesn't even have a legal trademarks field. This is probably a compiler thing, or they just thought it would look good to add a legal trademark. Again, Windows Service with a typo. And the original file name, look at that, game.exe, we already saw that in VirusTotal. So the original file name is not even remotely related to Microsoft, because that would be svc host.exe. Game.exe is not a legitimate Microsoft file as far as I'm aware. So even if we didn't have any VirusTotal report, I could be pretty sure this file is malicious and has to go together with its reference and the other file, which is related. So we're going to close this. Just for fun, let's also check virus total here. And again, it has a quite generous detection rate, so that confirms what we already found. A lot of suspicious things there. Okay, let's note this down for removal as well. And we have to ensure we copy two things here. We have to remove the registry reference, and we have to remove the file. We can, let's leave this open. Okay. This part is the value name. We need that. And this part is the file name. But the value name itself is not enough because we also need the key this value is located in. In this way, you can compare the Windows registry to the file system. In the file system, you have files and folders. A folder contains files. It may contain subfolders, which may contain files in turn. And just like that, the registry is composed of keys, and each key may have values and subkeys, which also could contain values. The value name is like the name of the file, and the value data is like the content of a file, except usually a lot simpler. Okay, so let's also copy the key name, so we know where to look for this value. There we go. We can delete this, and just let's put it on one line. I put this between the two to ensure it's not a subkey, it is a value. And here I could also make some comments. I'm not going to do that because I already explained it, and we're not on a typing course. So we could look further at this auto-run report. I'm not going to do that because it would take a lot of time to examine all these entries. You see something from WinRAR, more empties of the entries. I see hashtag. I see some from Java, Google, a lot of Microsoft stuff, but all of this is legitimate. You could research every line just as we did before. Look at the key, Google the key if you don't know what it is for. For example, Google the term run key, run value, Google alternate shell, Google shellx context menu handlers, any of these terms. If you Google them, for example, with a plus registry, you usually will get good search results that explain what the entry is. You can compare that with the file information you're expected to find there. Check if these files are legitimate, and that will help you make a list of what is legitimate and what is not. And this will be time consuming the first few times you do it, but the more you do it, the more familiar you get with it. And after a while, it really won't take more than a few minutes to go through a log like this one. Okay, now that we have identified everything, it's time for removal, the fun part. So we have 3 objects to remove, 2 files and 1 run value. All 3 belong to the same infection. You can know that because the name of the run value and the name of this file have an identical string. It would be an extraordinary coincidence if that was not the same malware family. So let's start removing. We can try that with auto-runs. Let's start with this one. We can right-click and delete. And auto-runs will ask us if we are sure. Yes, I'm really sure. But there's a problem. I can't delete it because the process cannot access the file. It is in use by another process. So if you get this error, it usually means the malware is running and really doesn't want you to terminate it. To make sure this can be removed, we will have to have a look at Process Explorer to see if the malware is running and to see if we can stop it that way. So I'm going to minimize this. I'm going to minimize this too and this too. And I'm going to start Process Explorer. Again with administrator privileges, because why not? This is a big list of all processes running. I have changed the font size. I'm going to make this a little bigger. It shows a lot more than Windows Task Manager. You could try to use Windows Task Manager in this case as well. It wouldn't be useful because it won't show the malicious process, while Process Explorer hopefully will. So let's look if we see any of the identified malicious files. Going through the list. And look at that. I found our svhost.exe file, complete with Windows serifs, names and all that. So we know this is the right process and we have to try to kill this. So let's just try kill process. Are you sure? Yes, I'm really sure. And that worked. We didn't get any alerts. Right now, it is good to monitor Process Explorer for a few more seconds to make sure the process doesn't respawn, because if it does, you will need to, for example, to reboot in safe mode and try the same thing, because in safe mode, run values and startup folder content isn't processed, so the malware won't be running unless it has other loading points, and then you may, for example, need to enter the recovery environment or use a different tool that has a bit more permissions. But in this case, that isn't necessary. It looks like the process hasn't respawned, so we should be able to kill our malware with Autorun now. And let's try that. So the same entry again, delete. Yes, I'm sure. And it's gone now. The entire folder disappeared because it's empty and Process Explorer is set to hide empty load points. You can enable that, but it just makes the log a lot bigger. Okay, next this one. We can do the same thing, delete. And now I want to bring up Regedit once again. We see the value here. We're selecting delete. Yes, I'm sure. And it's gone now. We can check that here as well by refreshing it. As you can see, the value is gone, but pay attention here. The file is not yet gone. We didn't do anything about the file, and we will need to do that another way. We could empty the temp folder. We could use a tool to empty the temp folder. We could use an antivirus scan at this point. It really doesn't matter because the malware is no longer running. And this file we have in the temp folder. Let's also go there. There we are. Our svhost.exe file is just any file now that can be deleted. I'm doing it with Shift Delete, Enter, and it's gone. And at this point, you have eliminated all running and visible malware. That does not mean all malware files are gone from the computer, because you may have noticed this beauty here, malwaredropper.exe. That is probably not a good file. At this point, if there is an antivirus program present on the machine, no matter what program it is a good idea to update it and run a scan to check for any leftover files on the machine and remove them. If there's no antivirus program present, you can install one at this point, because nobody and nothing will be blocking it, because the active malware is gone. Even if you have 100 files left on the machine that are malicious and were probably dropped, if they have no load point, they're not active and they can be removed by anyone. The problem is you shouldn't accidentally double click on them. So right now we can run a quick scan with the installed MCsoft. We would expect it to detect the dropper and nothing else, because this was a simple infection. It was not very complicated. But as you can see, the same principle really would apply if you were to have many other lines that were infected. And it really at this point the machine, even if it's not clean of malware files, is clean of loaded malware, and restarting the computer will not relaunch any malware. So you want to get rid of it. As you can see, the dropper has been picked up already, and the scan is almost done. It doesn't look like anything else is present, which means our mission was successful. Let's wait for it to finish. I'm checking some of the comments now. Yes, there's one question I can answer right now. There are some load points that are not detected by autoruns. The majority is, but I can't remember what it is. There are some. The 32-bit shell value isn't shown, if I'm not mistaken. That is not a big issue. The shell value is the value that is used to load the desktop. It's normally set to explorer.exe, and malware can change it. Normally, you would set it in the normal key for it, in the winlogon key. Is it located? Some malware uses that value. It's not effective because it won't be loaded, but it is a load point that is not shown, and I believe there are a few more. Okay, this was it as far as the demo.